Hello and welcome to everyone joining us from New York City and from around the world. For today's webinar, I am Kian Tajbakhsh, and as the coordinator of the Committee on Forced Migration at Columbia University's Global Centers, which has organized this event, I am pleased to welcome our distinguished panelists who will address what we can expect to see in US immigration law and policy in the coming years, and the impact it may have on migrants and displaced persons. I would like to thank Professor Elora Mukherjee for putting together today's panel. Professor Mukherjee is the Jerome Green Clinical Professor of Law at Columbia and is a globally recognized advocate, practitioner, and voice for immigrants, asylum seekers, and unaccompanied migrant children. Professor Mukherjee is the director of the Immigrants' Rights Clinic at Columbia Law School. I am also very pleased to welcome today's distinguished guests, Lee Gallant from the ACLU and Columbia Law School, and Professor Van Tran from CUNY Graduate Center. The Committee on Forced Migration is an initiative of the Columbia Global Centers, led by Professor Safwan Masri, the Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development. The Columbia Global Centers works within countries that host large numbers of refugees, and in cities such as Amman, Istanbul, Nairobi, and Tunis. In response to the combined crisis posed by the pandemic and forced migration, the Global Centers established the Committee on Forced Migration in 2018 to address this crisis. The committee brings together 50 plus faculty from across Columbia's schools and affiliates who work on forced migration, as well as those who desire to create a multidisciplinary academic and practical set of solutions to the crisis. This initiative is one of a number of forced migration-related activities the Global Center supports, including the Columbia University Scholarship for Displaced Students, the Amman Mellon Foundation Global Centers Fellowship Program for Emerging Displaced Scholars, the New University in Exile Consortium, a number of regionally focused forced migration-related programming hosted by our individual global centers. The goal of the Committee on Forced Migration is to maximize Columbia's ability to provide an institution-wide platform to engage, support, and share information across Columbia's community of faculty, students, and staff. And we also hope to act as a convener to bring together the world's thought leaders in global migration. Today is the fourth event of a year-long online series entitled Forced Migration in a Post-Pandemic World. And the series looks at the impact of this crisis on forced migration, both current and long-term, in the post-pandemic era. The events in our series feature eminent Columbia and external experts and voices from the front lines. Our next event will be on December 2nd at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on disease surveillance and refugees. And it will look at the issue of balancing human rights and public health in the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact it's had on migrants and other marginalized groups. I thank you for joining us for this event. And now I turn it over to Elora, who will moderate today's program and introduce our speakers more fully.
Thank you very much, Kian, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. We are grateful for your interest in these topics, and I'm particularly grateful that both Lee Gallant and Van Tran are joining us this morning to share their expertise. The two questions that we will explore over the next hour or so is what happened during the Trump years that resulted in America's borders closing to the world, and what can we expect over the coming 4 years? I will briefly speak for about a minute or two about some of the work I've done during the Trump years to highlight how disgusting immigration policy has become under this administration. Then I will turn it over first to Lee and then to Van. So last summer, in the summer of 2019, I was among a group of monitors for the Flores Settlement Agreement, an agreement that provides for basic protections for the safety and well-being of immigrant children who have come to this country alone. What my colleagues and I found at border detention centers were children who were hungry, dirty, frightened, detained for prolonged periods of time after being separated from family members, including their parents. And we testified before Congress and tried to bring these issues to light in hopes of changing how immigrant children, unaccompanied minors specifically, are treated by this administration. Currently, I'm working on behalf of women who are detained in Ocilla, Georgia, at a detention center there. They have been subjected to non-consensual, invasive, medically unnecessary gynecological procedures. And once they are making their identities known to federal government investigators, they're being retaliated against with imminent deportations. So these are two examples of how immigrants are being treated in the Trump years. And I would love for Lee to kick it off by talking about his amazing, groundbreaking litigation and policy and advocacy efforts over the past 4 years. Just so you all know, Lee has been working nonstop around the clock almost since the Trump inauguration to try to save America's soul.
Well, with that introduction, I have to be scintillating. Thank you, Laura. Thank you for having me on the committee. This is great. I'm thrilled to be here. So what I thought I would do in the few minutes I have is just sort of sketch some of the major border policies, asylum policies that the Trump administration has enacted, and then maybe at the Q&A stage we can get into it in more detail. There's sort of 6 really big ones I think of. The first was the attempt to deter asylum seekers from Central America by taking their children away. That came to be known as the Trump administration's family separation practice. And the thought was by the administration, if we take a child away, those parents will give up and the word will get back to Central America. Don't come and seek asylum in America because you'll lose your child. The ACLU got an injunction against that policy, but as many of you have probably seen in the news, we are still looking for some of the families, and families, hundreds and hundreds, are still separated. And needless to say, that's a shameful policy. In my 30 years of doing this work, it's the worst thing I have seen. And I just say 2 quick things about it. One is that it was never going to deter people from coming. When I would meet with families who were just reunited because of the lawsuit or still waiting to get their children back, I would always ask them, would you have come anyway if you knew your child was going to be taken from you? And inevitably they would just shrug and say, well, what choice did I have? It would have been as bad as this is. It would have even been worse if I stayed because my child might have been killed. I might have been killed. So, and I think that's something that everyone knew that was not going to deter. Every prior administration, Democratic or Republican, had refused to engage in family separation, knowing it wouldn't deter. But the second point is, even if it were a deterrent, there's just some things you don't do. And one of them is taking a child away. And I think that's something that every prior administration, again, Democratic or Republican, recognized. And that's why we've seen really across the board outrage over family separation like we haven't seen about any other policy that the Trump administration is engaging in the immigration area. And that's why, Laura Bush came out and said, look, I was married to a Republican president. We didn't always agree with the Democrats on macro immigration policy, but there's just some things you don't do. That's why you saw the Pope come out, the conservative religious leaders. So that was sort of their first attempt to deter asylum. The next thing they did is what we refer to as Asylum Ban 1, the first asylum ban. And what that did was say you can't apply for asylum unless you enter legally at a port of entry. If you enter across the border illegally between ports, you can't seek asylum. And that's something that we sued over, got enjoined, and has remained enjoined since its announcement. And that was announced by President Trump to big fanfare. And the one thing I would say about that quickly is, for those of you who are expert in this area, it may seem obvious that, of course, you can't deny even the right to apply for asylum based on how one enters. But part of what's been going on the last 4 years is not only the fight in court, but also the fight to regain a narrative about migration and asylum seekers. And President Trump, of course, has an enormous bully pulpit, reaches millions and millions of people quickly. And his soundbite made intuitive sense to a lot of people who didn't know the circumstances of facts around asylum seekers, right? It just says, look, we're not denying asylum to you. You can still apply for asylum, just do it legally. Just go to a port of entry and apply legally. And for even people who are not antagonistic to asylum seekers or Central Americans, that didn't seem at first blush so unreasonable. So one of the big challenges for us was not only going into court and convincing a court that it was illegal, but to sort of regain the narrative. And that can be difficult, right? People flip the channel if you get sort of too weedy and too nuanced. But what we needed to tell people is it's not so simple just to go to a port of entry and apply legally. Sometimes you're with your 4-year-old child and the next port may be 400 miles away and you're not going to walk those 400 miles. Or you don't actually even know where a port of entry is or know the rule. Or sometimes cartels are pushing you to cross in a particular place. And sometimes under the Trump administration, there were ports of entry that wouldn't even take your asylum application, putting the lie to what the administration was saying. But I mention all that because I do think the last 4 years has been not only a fight in the courts, but a fight to regain the narrative. And I think one of the real challenges for us has been, how do we have an intuitive, simple message that what they're doing is not proper? And that goes again to the next policy, the third one, what was called the asylum ban 2, or the transit ban. And that said, if you go through a third country, you need to apply for asylum there. If you're coming by land to the southern border. And so that meant everyone but Mexicans, right? Because everyone's going to transit through Mexico. So everyone is good. And effectively, that would mean an end to asylum, just about an end to asylum, right? Because it's everybody but Mexicans, and the exceptions were very, very limited. And again, there was an intuitive message by the Trump administration, right? It said, look, why should we have the complete burden? If they're really endangered, presumably they'd want to apply for safety in the first place they get to, let another country have them look at their asylum application. We will look at it if they're denied asylum, but why shouldn't they at least apply in the first place they get to? And again, that's not a message that doesn't resonate with even people who think I want to do the right thing, but that seems reasonable. That is a policy, though, that we challenged. We got enjoined nationwide by the Federal Court of Appeals, but unfortunately the Supreme Court stepped in and said the policy could continue until they hear the case. We and others brought another lawsuit in DC and have gotten it joined. So that policy remains enjoined now. And I know that I'm just sort of ticking through policies, but there's just so many, and I just wanted to sort of sketch them out a little without much detail. The fourth thing the administration does, and I think just the fact that there's so many, I think is telling that how hard the administration was trying to eliminate Central Americans from coming here. The fourth was what's called Remain in Mexico, MPP, which said you can apply for asylum, but you have to wait in Mexico for your hearings. And so in some respects, that's better because you get to actually apply for asylum, but you remain in Mexico. And if it were just Mexicans waiting in Mexico, maybe they're waiting at their homes. But of course, these are non-Mexicans as well who have nowhere to live. So there's now 70,000 people stuck in Mexico in squalid conditions, dangerous conditions, being picked off by cartels. And then when COVID hits, it's making things even worse. So that policy is now in effect because the Supreme Court has let it go in effect, and barring any change by the Biden administration, which I assume we'll talk about during Q&A, that's going to be heard by the Supreme Court in late winter, early spring. And we'll see what the Supreme Court does. But that is a very dangerous policy, because what the administration's trying to do is deter people from coming, because the conditions are so bad in Mexico that people will just give up, and so dangerous. And that's what's happening. And originally they said, well, we won't use it for families, for little kids, but that's gone out the window. And now there are just thousands and thousands of families with little children walking around Mexico trying to find a place to live, and scared to walk outside for even a second because of the cartels, being picked off by cartels within dangerous detention centers. The next policy that and then, and this is a situation where they're just every 2 weeks they're enacting a new policy. The fifth one was called Safe Third Country, and that's where it says you will not be allowed to apply for asylum in the United States. We will send you to a third country where we have an agreement that they will look at your asylum claim. And we have that with Canada. And in Canada, people can argue about, is Canada's system better than ours better than that? But, there's some sense in which you could say, well, that works because both countries are safe. Both countries have asylum systems. But what's happened with what the Trump administration is doing is they're sending people to Guatemala or Honduras, or that's what they intended to do. And we're challenging that as well with other groups. Those countries do not have functioning asylum systems. Plus, it's extremely dangerous. The very people that people are running from can get to them in those countries. So if they're leaving El Salvador or Honduras and going to Guatemala, those countries are not safe for them. And plus, those countries do not have functioning asylum systems. So it's essentially sending people somewhere where asylum is not a realistic option. So far, other than a few people, that policy has not been implemented for reasons largely related to COVID, but that also will be an enormous danger. And finally, the last policy, in some ways, and in my view, may be the most dangerous, although it may be temporary, and that's what's called the Title 42 COVID policy, which says that people cannot come to the country to seek asylum because it's too dangerous due to COVID. I mean, and I think everyone can understand that the Trump administration has said, go to the beach, do this, do that, don't wear masks. But the one place they've said we absolutely have to have a complete lockdown is with asylum seekers, right? And so there's been numerous articles showing that the CDC, the orders from the CDC didn't actually think that you needed this for public health, and that they were overruled by the White House, which of course makes sense. And what that policy does is that it bypasses the entire asylum system and summarily expels even children, unaccompanied children, as well as adults and families immediately without any hearing whatsoever. There's supposedly a small screening for torture. I don't think that's actually a meaningful screening, but you are not allowed to apply for asylum. And I would just end on this, is that I think that's an underreported story about Title 42, but the truth is that that's the most extreme of all the policies, because everyone's worried about the tinkering the Trump administration is doing within the asylum process. Well, none of that matters if Title 42 remains in effect, because you don't even get into the asylum system. You're immediately expelled. And the administration says these are public health laws that operate outside of all the protections for asylum seekers. And so what happens, especially for children, is you're held secretly in hotels on the border or other places, and then expelled anywhere from 24 hours to 5 days without any asylum hearing. So it doesn't matter how much the administration tinkers with the asylum system if Title 42 remains in effect. And I don't think a lot of people realize that there's been, since COVID, a complete shutdown of asylum seekers. And a lot of countries, of course, are closing their borders, and a lot of people want to see border closures. But the one thing other countries have not done in Western Europe and Canada is say, we're going to close it down even for asylum seekers, much less children, right? I mean, there have to be restrictions on border crossings at this point because of COVID, or I think most public health officials feel that. But what is clear according to public health officials, is that we can quarantine people who may test positive or have any symptoms and allow them to apply for asylum, so that even if we don't have complete open borders, or not open borders, but the borders we used to have, we certainly can look at asylum seekers the way Western European countries and Canadians are doing. But that hasn't been happening under the Trump administration. I think it remains to be seen how the Biden administration will deal with that, given that their signature election issue has been fighting COVID. So I thought maybe I would stop there. I know it's a lot of sort of eye glazing stuff, but tried to sketch out just, if you take nothing from it, I think you hopefully can take that the Trump administration has been determined to close the border to asylum seekers, and what's motivating them is closing it to non-white asylum seekers from Central America.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you so much for that spectacular overview and for everything you've been doing. Now I'd like to turn it over to Professor Van Tran. Van is one of the nation's thought leaders and top scholars in this area of the law. And every time he speaks, I learn so much from him. I am so grateful that you're taking time today, Van, to join us. And to all the participants here in New York and around the world, I encourage you to participate in the chat and send us your Q&A. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to say that I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to the Committee on Forced Migration and Professor Elora Mukherjee for the kind invitation to speak. This is a topic that's rather dear and close to my heart, so I have strong opinions. However, fortunately for you and for me, my opinions are based on facts and facts alone. I wanted to start where Lee left off, which is that America is closed, but I would push it further and say that America has been closed for quite some time now. And although the pandemic has worsened the restrictions that we saw under the Trump administration, the trend has been one of ongoing and continuing and increasing restriction over the last 4 years. So in the few minutes that I have, I would just try to place this in the broader context of migration flow worldwide with a focus on refugees. Lee has spoken extensively about the fight against the southern border, where asylees are basically clamoring to get into the United States, but there's also a broader context of refugee restriction that is really important. And I speak from the perspective of someone who's a refugee himself, so these topics, once again, are very, very close to my personal experiences, and this, I hope, would contribute to the perspective to often drive policy discussion and deliberation. And then I'll end with some remarks on what exactly the Biden administration should be doing in the next 4 years to reverse the very, very harmful policies that you have heard from Lee and many more that you have not heard about under the Trump administration to restore America's leadership, both moral and global, around the world. So as all of you know, forced migration is now a crisis in the world. As of 2020, we know that there are about 79.5 million displaced people. And this is in the context of 7.9 billion total population worldwide. So only 1% of the world population is either internally displaced or are refugees or are seeking asylum status. But think about that, 1%, the number doesn't seem to be quite large, but the challenge is that the number of displaced people are deeply concentrated in only certain pockets of the world, which basically meant that the consequences of such concentration and displacement are disproportionately felt right now in the global south, because the global north, including the United States, has basically abandoned our mission of offering refuge to those who are in need, a commitment that we made as a country since 1951, when we signed or participate in the Convention for Refugees, and also since 1980, when we basically officially formalized the Refugee Act of 1980 to receive refugees from around the world. Just to give you a sense of contrast, right? I mean, in 1980, when we passed the Refugee Act of 1980, we basically received roughly 200,000 refugees per year. As of last year, the Trump administration has cut it back to only 15,000, and actually no, 18,000, just to be precise. But among the 18,000 as of today, only 12,000 out of the 18,000 have been resettled in the U.S. And next year, 2021, the projected number will be only 15,000, the lowest in basically 4 decades. And this is problematic because it's occurring during a moment when the world is in great need of refuge. And I think in many, many ways, we forget that among, right, the 79 million people I just told you, virtually half of them were children. Half of them, 31 million, are children. And this is really a very, very vulnerable population, and they have been made more vulnerable ever since the pandemic. And the reason for that is simple. Refugees live in very crowded situations, lacking some of the basic needs like education, healthcare, and sanitation, and of course, housing. And therefore, when you think about the spread of the pandemic and the way in which the current COVID-19 virus spread, they are basically placed in the most vulnerable situation possible because of the close contact. And I think, if anything, their lives will be devastated because in many of these camps across the world, there is virtually no advanced healthcare beyond the very basics. And so, you know, if you are contracting the virus, chances are you will be likely to either struggle with it, and if you are of a certain age or a certain condition, you are likely to die from it. So this is the situation that we are in right now, and much of it has to do with the Trump administration's refusal to sort of understand that we, as a country, have had a long tradition of leading in this regard. In fact, until 2018, the United States of America alone resettled more refugees than the rest of the world combined until 2018. And right now, we are resettling roughly the same numbers as Canada and some other countries in Europe, a dramatic decline. I wanted to come back and speak a little bit about why this is so important in this particular moment. Well, obviously, we all know that the anti-immigration agenda from the Trump administration has been, by and large, pushed through by a very few, kind of select few people who are really interested in undermining kind of our country's sort of a promise, if you will, of opportunities to the world. But I think what we often forget is the fact that these policies, which were mostly put in place through presidential proclamations, can also be easily reversed by the same process if the Biden administration were to sign into law a series of presidential proclamations and or executive orders. And I think that is the one silver lining of this entire process, that is all of these different destructive elements were not put in place by law or by Congress. And I think it makes it a bit more easy for us to reverse that harm. The other thing I want to say is the reason why the southern border has been under siege is not only because of the violence and the climate change that we know are basically the underlying causes of the outflow of migration from, as Lee mentioned, the kind of Central American countries of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. But the most acute crisis right now in Latin America is not from those three countries, but instead is from Venezuela, where since 2017 or so, some 4.5 million people have been displaced, making them the largest internally displaced population in Latin America. And that pressure for outward migration is also contributing to the tremendous needs for asylum seeking on the southern border. Now, some people claim that, well, the reduction of the kind of, refugee ceiling might have been offset by the fact that we have been offering more asylum status to some. And some of my recent research showed the exact opposite. That is, despite the decrease in refugee admission, the number of asylees that we have been allowing to enter or to claim status has basically stayed constant over the last 10 years or so. So there's no offsetting because these two categories, as you know, are rather closely related to each other. So if anything, we have been really cutting back significantly. And this is a moment when I kind of want to bring us back to 1980, right? Where 1980 is a very interesting moment because that was when Ronald Reagan came into office. And here, another Republican president, in his statement about immigration policy in 1981 in particular, he emphasized the various principles under which American immigration policy should be guided. And he said, and I quote, "We shall continue America's tradition as a land that welcomes peoples from other countries. We shall also, with other countries, continue to share in the responsibility of welcoming and resettling those who flee oppression." He then further said, "We must also recognize that both the United States and Mexico have historically benefited from Mexicans obtaining employment in the United States. A number of our states have special labor needs, and we should take these into account." He further stated that illegal immigrants in considerable numbers have become productive members of society and are a basic part of our workforce. And finally, he concluded that my administration has he finally concluded that we must allow them legal status. At the same time, to be fair, he said, in so doing, we must not encourage illegal immigration. So 40 years ago, America was a very different country, but I quoted those passages to show that we were a sensible country back then. And we are now in an irrational period of policy making that is driven exclusively by ideology, not by rational debate and by the rule of law. And let me just, one final piece of this, and then I'll conclude, and that has to do with, obviously, the Mexican Wall, which is the symbol, if you will, of the barrier that we're erecting towards the southern border and also the Latin American countries. Now, as of October 2020, we know that the Trump administration declared that they have successfully built 400 miles of this border. With money that they did not have, 70% of which was not approved by Congress, but instead shifted from other areas like national defense to build this wall. The cost, roughly $150 billion have been spent, roughly $21 million per mile. Let me repeat, $21 million per mile. And this wasteful monument, if you will, is actually a commemoration of our failure to provide refuge, but also enshrine the xenophobia, the anti-immigrant sentiment, the neglect of human rights abuse around the world, and also the refusal to accept the environmental damages that are occurring across the world, which led to this forced migration to begin with. And this monumental failure of this administration really should enrage all of us because we are in the middle of the pandemic and resources are limited. Millions of Americans are employed. Many more millions are lining up for food pantry just to get by. And we're wasting $21 million to build every mile of the wall south of the Texas-Arizona border. But this wall is also symbolic in multiple ways because the Trump administration has repeatedly claimed we will make Mexico pay for it. That's nonsense, and it's a lie, obviously, because Mexico has not paid even half a dime towards building of this wall. It's the American taxpayers' dollars. But let me say one final note on this, and then I'll conclude, which is that to the rest of the world, America has always been the beacon of hope. America has always been the place that people look forward to for leadership in a world that is increasingly chaotic and destabilized, right? We were, as John Winthrop said many, many years ago or centuries ago, right? We must always consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill in the eyes of all people upon us, and the eyes of the world are in fact upon us, because we are one of, if not the most prosperous and wealthy country in the world. And again, I quote Kennedy, president-elect in 1961, when he made his first statement at the State House of Boston, the birthplace of American Revolution. For those to whom much is given, much is required. We could say that, well, America can barely take care of our own domestic population. How do we have the time, energy, and resources to take care of the rest of the world? I reject that premise, because to whom much is given, much is required. And as a country, we do have the resources. Just look at the 1% of our country, and we know that we do have the resources. Just look at the funding pouring into the various races across the country, both from the Democratic side and the Republican side. We do have the resources to make a difference in the lives of millions. Finally, let me end by saying that the Biden administration has a unique opportunity to reverse much of these harms. So obviously, the Muslim ban should be reversed immediately. DACA should be restored. It was restored just a few days ago, but I think it should be restored and expanded. The undocumented population in our country who have been law-abiding residents should be given a chance for citizenship or a legal path to naturalization of some sort. We should definitely strengthen the refugee resettlement program and the asylum seeking program, which Lee has spoken about. And one of the damaging impacts of reducing the refugee numbers in our country over the last 4 years is that the infrastructure within the refugee resettlement program has shrunk significantly, making it impossible for us to ramp up again. There are costs that are really associated with this reduction that's not easy to be reversed. And of course, haunting the building or the continuing building of the Mexican wall. Not reversing, because obviously we're not going to take away $21 million per mile wall, but we're going to try to create ways in which we can improve our relationship with the global South, because in a position of leadership, the global North and the countries of the global North often forget, right, that we are occupying a position of asymmetric power economic relationship with the rest of the world. And if you're in such a position, you ought to be much more cognizant of your impact and the consequences of your actions on the rest of the world, which is the same thing that you could say about the presidency. Because of your office, you ought to be very cautious in your actions and your words. So the Biden administration, I hope, is prepared to reverse all of the above, to restore our kind of moral leadership in the eyes of the world. But most importantly, one of the reasons why the forced migration crisis has reached its peak today has everything to do with the fact that there were many kind of armed conflicts unfolding across the world, and these armed conflicts would have been mediated by American diplomacy, which we have none of at the moment to speak. And therefore, we are also indirectly contributing to that crisis by not providing the leadership that we historically have been able to provide. So I've just stopped there for now, and I can go on forever, but I would love to have a more interactive sessions, and then we can also invite all of you in the audience to participate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Van. Thank you for reminding us of our nation's historical leadership in this area and how far we have come in 40 years. So Van, you so eloquently laid out what your asks of a Biden-Harris administration would be. And Lee, I'd love to turn to you. What are your asks for the next administration? What are your top priorities?
Sorry. Well, let me just, I don't necessarily want to give you a comprehensive list and risk that I leave out certain things, because I think we're still figuring out a little bit. I think, just as Vance, we'd like to see a legalization program. We've always liked to see comprehensive immigration reform, DACA, of course. On family separation, we'd like to see something done immediately to allow parents to come back to the U.S. to rejoin their children and to be those families to be given some type of status given what they've been put through. We'd like to see a change to the migration policy, the MPP, having people remain in Mexico immediately. And there is an urgency to that because the Supreme Court is going to hear arguments in the end of the winter, early spring. I think we would like to see all the asylum policies reversed at the border. The list goes on. There are elimination of due process for people in the interior if the government claims unilaterally they've been here up to 2 years illegally, they can be deported without a hearing. I think it goes on, but we would like to see a legalization process, DACA, and elimination of all these border policies, Title 42. There are unfortunately a long list of policies. And we'll see how the Biden administration reacts to. I think.
Right. So among the three of us, we have many, many asks and demands of the next administration. Given the political moment that we're in and the constraints that the new administration will face, including given the pandemic, what do you think is reasonable to expect? What can those listening into this call, watching this conversation, actually expect to happen in the coming year or two?
Are you asking me? So I mean, Van, I am, not someone who's dealing with the politics of it on a day-to-day. And so I don't even want to venture a guess. I can only say what we hope will happen, but I don't want to try and give it a political assessment. I mean, Van, you may do that.
So let me begin by saying that one of the myths in American immigration policy is that Congress made laws when it comes to allow immigrants to come in. But in a recent book that was just published this year by two law professors, Adam Cox at NYU and Christina Rodriguez at Yale, titled The President and Immigration Law, they argue convincingly and compellingly that the presidency has always been the immigration law policy maker in chief. And that really is a surprising insight, but an insight that we see fully illustrated under the Trump administration. And therein lies the hope that the Biden administration can, with a stroke of a pen, reverse as many of these harmful policies as possible. And they are prepared to do so based on the preliminary reporting that we have heard from their transition team. I do want to come back to where Laura started, which is that we are now facing a pandemic that is global in scope. And therefore, we have to be reasonable because in some sense, the pandemic imposes its own movement and restrictions on mobility in every single way, from state to county to localities, and of course, borders control. So I think one helpful insight would be to compare, for example, right, how the United States deal with the pandemic with the rest of the world since the onset of the pandemic in February 2020. And during the first 4 months of the pandemic, the United States passed or signed into law some 18 different policies, most of which were banning or suspending migration into the United States. Starting obviously most famously with the China ban, but of course the European ban, and then of course the ban on the UK and Ireland, and the ban on every kind of refugee resettlement program, and the ban on, most recently, the entry of what they call aliens who present a risk to the U.S. labor market following the coronavirus. And that was June 2020. And in fact, Laura has a piece titled America is Closed in Slate, which I strongly recommend that you read. It has to do with, obviously, the shutting down of the H-1B visa for highly skilled professionals. So we have been clamping down not just the illegal immigration, not just the refugee, but also the third piece of this, which is legal immigration. As I teach immigration policy, immigration law, I've been referred to immigration policy in the US as having three different streams: the front door, the back door, and the side door. The front door is legal immigration, the back door is illegal immigration, undocumented, and the side door is refugees. So what you see is just a three-pronged attack. And we should be selective in what we can do over the next year. My hope is the following. There is the kind of, possibility of a vaccine, which I hope is going to help mediate a lot of these difficulties. So there's the immediate short run, where I think that some restrictions should remain in place so that we are cautious in not facilitating the spread of the pandemic globally by encouraging the movement of people. But that's the short term. The long term should always be one of significant expansion of all of these different programs to, again, provide a beacon of hope to the rest of the world. Now, let me just draw a different analogy, just for the sake of the conversation. After 9/11, we did shut down immigration very significantly, including the refugee protection program. But the Bush administration at the time made it very clear that that shutdown was temporary. It was meant to last only 3 months. And in our case, we could also argue that the Biden administration can say that the continuing restriction that we might have been in place could continue for another 12 months or so, or 6 months or so, until we can actually get everything under control. But I think that in discussing the Biden agenda earlier, I was referring to a vision over the next 4 years and not just the immediate kind of, next steps. But I think that my gut feeling and my heart lie with the most vulnerable in our world. And if I have to pick and choose among different and competing priorities in terms of migration movement, I would always focus on the refugee, the displacement of people, but also the asylum-seeking individuals, and certainly, more certainly, unaccompanied minors, which are now increasingly a big part of our asylum-seeking population. Those are and continue to be the world's most vulnerable, and therefore they deserve our protection. And that, I think, would be my most important recommendation. Let me just say one final word on this. That is to say that resettlement of refugees, IDPs, is not the solution to the crisis we're facing right now, because the capacity for refuge can only meet about 3 to 5% of the total need for refuge around the world. So put differently, only 3 to 5% of the world's refugees are being resettled. And therefore, we need to come up with a different paradigm to deal with what we call protracted situations. Refugees have been in the same position for the last 20 years. These are protracted situations. They are not going to be resettled anytime soon. We have to be realistic, and therefore strengthening our collaboration with other countries of the world, with various, multinational corporations, organizations, nonprofit institutions, to create solutions that are very, very much based in the places where the refugees are living. And that, I think, would be one medium-term solution. And then there's also a final long-term solution, which is that we need to attack the root causes of displacement. And if I have to summarize everything, I would just say there are 3 of them. Armed conflicts, which increasingly have been harming civilians, which again is against our own humanitarian international laws. Second, and the US has done nothing to intervene. That's the other problem that we are facing around the world. But second is basically violence-based displacement, right? Gang violence, for example, from the El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And the third is basically climate change, which we cannot be in denial of. We see that in our very own country. And climate change has basically created unlivable conditions for millions around the world. So until we have the will and the resources to tackle these three major causes, we shall not solve this problem. And I think that, again, as I often say, the solution for undocumented migration to the US is not a war or shutting down immigration, but economic development in Mexico and in Latin America. That should be our long-term solution, and that is also both in our self-interest, if we want to get immigration under control, but also other interests, which is to help and to assist other countries that need our help to develop. And I think that is consistent, right, with the vision of what America stands for and with the values that we hold dear.
Thank you so much, Van. Lee, is there anything you want to add before we move to Q&A?
No, I would just say, I mean, I think we should take some questions. I would just say I agree that the one thing about immigration is that because so much was done by the president unilaterally, it could be undone by the Biden administration. And so he has made statements about many things that he will reverse, and hopefully he will stick to them.
Okay, so I'm looking at the question chat, which I think Lee and Van, you both have access to as well. And I'd like to start off with the question posed by Professor Nara Milanic at Barnard. Thank you, Nara, for joining us this morning. It's great to have you here. And Nara writes, a few weeks ago, Biden announced that he would form a task force to reunite separated families. Of course, the ACLU and many other organizations have been involved in such efforts for more than 2 years. And Nara further writes, I want to hear you speak beyond reunification to reparations, redress, repair. Could you give an update on litigation efforts to provide redress to these families? Do you expect the Biden administration to facilitate these efforts in some way? Lee, this is a question directed for you.
Okay, thanks, Nara. So very quickly, our 4 asks of the Biden administration on family separation are going to be allow parents to come back to the US to rejoin their children, which the Trump administration has not allowed. Second, give them some type of status. What many people don't realize is that the Trump administration is still trying to deport all of these families. We want them, give them some type of status, just like crime victims. The third is to create a fund to provide help to the families, including medical help. And the fourth is to change the practice of family separations going forward. So it's not Border Patrol and ICE officials, but child welfare experts with judicial oversight only when there's objective evidence that the parent is in imminent danger to the child. So those are going to be the asks of the Biden administration. In court, we have filed a separate class action lawsuit in Arizona seeking damages both from the United States, but also from individual defendants who we believe are responsible. Sessions, Stephen Miller on down. Our fear is that the litigation will take years and years to get damages. And so what we're hoping is that the Biden administration settles all that litigation and decides to provide some type of fund. I don't, in terms of sort of classic reparations, I think Congress will have to get involved. I think there is some movement in Congress about that. I don't know whether it's going to be styled that way, but we are hoping to get some kind of fund created to help the families. But most immediately, we need them to get back to the United States because they're in danger and not to be deported. But then after that, and as soon as possible, because I think the catch-22 is that people say, well, you don't need to worry about that right now, the money, the funds. And then when we get too far out, people say, well, that's so far in the past, let's move forward. And so I think we want to move quickly and not be deterred about that. But doing it through litigation could take a long time. So we hope that the Biden administration will try and do something quickly on that.
The next question I'm going to take is posed by Alejandra Silva Hernandez, and she's asking, do you foresee the revival of Dapa? For those on the call who may not be familiar with Dapa, it's Deferred Action for Parents of Americans. And Van or Lee, I'd like to pose this question to either of you, whoever feels like answering.
You want to go, Van?
I'll just say briefly that, yes, I hope DAPA shall be on the table because DACA is not enough. DAPA will help provide the stability for many of the children who are basically, for all intended purposes, Americans. And there has been a lot of very good research that show the harmful consequences growing up in an undocumented household. So DAPA will provide that stability to, again, a population that's very marginalized. And whether or not it's going to be at the top of our agenda, we do not know because really we have way too many things going on at the moment. But I certainly hope that over the next 4 years, not just DACA and DAPA, but a path to naturalization of some sort shall be brokered in Congress. In a bipartisan fashion, but because I should remind everyone that, you know, every major immigration policy reform over the last 30 years in the United States has had major support from both parties. And it's not just a Democrat or Republican thing, it's actually a joint adventure.
Lee, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, you know, we're hoping that there can be some broad-based legalization, and that I think, you know, what's critical is that these issues remain in the news. So I think we all know that issues, they slip out of the news. There's not sort of groundswell political pressure for them. So I think we're going to have to keep it up. And unfortunately, because this Trump administration did so many things across the board beyond immigration, there are a lot of constituencies that have their own long list of things. And I think it's going to be critical that we all keep this in the news and not let people forget about the human suffering the Trump administration has caused. So I'm hoping DACA, DAPA, but just even a broad-based legalization program can eventually emerge, but we'll see.
Okay, so we are now running up against our time. So I wanted to turn it over to Lee and Van in case you have any brief closing remarks that you'd like to share with our participants today.
Van?
You want to go first?
No, you go first.
Well, I just want to say to everyone who's out there, thank you for being here. Thank you for being attentive. Thank you for taking the time to, you know, increase your own awareness and those of others about these important and critical issues. One of the things I was most disappointed about in the election campaign season this year has been that immigration was never on the agenda to be discussed, never mentioned explicitly during the various presidential debate. I understand the context of COVID and how important it is that we do not kind of get distracted by immigration, but I think immigration is not just core and central to American identity, but also to our future. To our future in a very compelling way, because the most creative, the most motivated, the most dedicated people have fled persecutions throughout the world to be here in this country, and we benefited greatly from this. So I think that if we remind ourselves of the multiple contributions, not just economic, but cultural and social, that immigrants and their children have made to our country, then we would recognize the importance of prioritizing migration policy despite all of the challenges that we face. And I would just end by reminding everyone that actually two of our first African-American president and now Vice President Harris are basically children of immigrants. And in Harris' case, she's truly what we call the second generation, a child of two immigrant parents. And I think it shows the tremendous potential of their contribution to our country, and the fact that they are occupying, or they have occupied the highest office in our land is a testament to the promise of America as a country of opportunities. And I hope that we will, as a country, come together and restore the broken promise that we made to the world.
Yeah, and I agree with all that. I want to thank Alora and Columbia and the committee for hosting this and for everyone participating. You know, I remain convinced that the only way we are really going to get a lot of stuff done is by changing the narrative. And the only way we're going to change the narrative is to be able to show things in a human dimension. And so we need to get positive stories out there. We need to, I think there's a real danger that abstract policy arguments and accurate statistics blur the human dimension of what's going on. And so I'm hopeful that over the next 4 years, the narrative will change and we will not see immigrants and asylum seekers as dangerous people. So I think that's going to be critical for us making changes in the court and obviously in Congress and pushing the Biden administration to do things. So, but I'm hopeful that we will turn this corner.
Lee, Van, thank you so much for taking time to join us today and for sharing your brilliant and heartbreaking insights. Thank you both very much, and thank you to all of our participants. Have a good day, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.